For the break, and now we go international. We go over to Erol Morkoc, who's over in California from Republican Overseas, to discuss with him all that's going on when it comes to Donald J. Trump. Erol, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for coming on. Appreciate you joining us. If you don't mind, I'll just play a quick clip of President Trump giving his latest opinion on what's been going on in his conversations with President Putin of Russia.
Yeah, I'll give you an update. I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay? We're in the middle of talking, and he's shooting rockets into Kiev and other cities. I don't like it at all.
So, Mr. President, what do you want to do about that?
I'm surprised. I'm very surprised. We'll see what we're going to do. What am I going to tell you? You're the fake news, aren't you? You're totally fake. All right, any other questions? I don't like what Putin is doing, not even a little bit. He's killing people. And something happened to this guy, and I don't like it.
Well, very powerful words and punchy words there. Erol, President Trump has not been holding back when it comes to international diplomacy. I must say I was a huge fan of what we saw in the White House when it came to holding the South African Prime Minister accountable for what's going on there towards predominantly white farmers. Is he right to call President Putin crazy? Is that going to help anything? Does he now, as in President Trump, need to take more firm action? Is it time to really ramp up some sanctions on Russia?
Well, it's a tough situation because Putin is not responding to the overtures the Trump administration had hoped he would, and the collaboration and maybe relationship Donald Trump originally thought that he had with him isn't panning out, at least on the battlefield. They had a couple-hour phone call a few days ago, but from the end of that, there was no ceasefire. There was no result. When you talk about ratcheting up sanctions, really the next step is to start sanctioning other countries that do business with the Russians to block them out. And that gets into a little bit of a dicier situation. Additionally, there were reports, and it is out of there, so you never know, but there was a close call with Putin's helicopter, that they had almost been able to shoot it down, some drone situation. So this could be retaliatory, Putin's behavior, obviously in the peace talks, if there had been an attempt on his life, not giving him any excuses, but trying to figure out his psychology here. But Trump is obviously not happy. And I think the next step is to show a further military commitment to the Ukrainians. I think that's more plausible than the additional sanctions, which are going to go kind of on emerging market countries that are tied to the Russian economy, which will be tough for them. And I think the Russians will be less affected than we thought. Also with the original sanctions, we thought, wow, that's really going to buckle their economy. It didn't really. They're running a wartime economy, and Putin is obviously very angry, and he's not working with President Trump. So it's a disappointment all around. Do I think the language is helpful? Maybe, because it's Trump, and when he pushes a button, it gets the ball rolling in a different way. Usually that kind of language is deleterious to any sort of peace negotiations, but he has a point. When you're shooting missiles into civilian areas and you're trying to talk about peace, it is crazy. And, you saw he called Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man. That ended up in at least peace talks. So, it can go a lot of ways, but overall, it's a disappointing beginning or middle part of this situation for President Trump and the Republican Party.
Over here in the UK, people would suggest that Trump is a Putin puppet. Some others would say he's a Putin apologist. Others would say that he's been completely mugged off by President Putin, that Donald J. Trump has basically he's been the perfect voice for the Putin propaganda against President Zelensky, against the Ukrainian people, and has therefore enabled President Putin to feel emboldened that he's basically got a soft touch in the White House. What would you say to that criticism?
I would say that, you just got to look at the scoreboard. If you look at the start of the century, you have George Bush as president, or W. Bush. Putin invaded Georgia. Then you have Obama. Putin took Crimea. Then you had Joe Biden, and he invaded the rest of Ukraine. And there was a guy in between that, Mr. President Trump, who they did not invade. Imagine you have a puppet, the guy who you've controlled. You finally get him in charge, and then you do nothing. You invade nobody while he's there. It's a poor strategy, I would say, if he was such a useful asset. In this situation, when they criticize him for at least, I mean, I see what they're saying when he pushes some Russian perspectives, but he's also trying to be a mediator, and he's come out and said that I'm here to mediate the situation. Means I'm going to go talk to the Russians, I'm going to go talk to the Ukrainians, and come back with that. Now, if he's going to at least be courteous in a mediator situation, he needs to at least put forth their perspective or understand their perspective. Now, their perspective, while morally repugnant, they do have at least a tactical argument that they've made for why this is going on. And that tactical argument is something that the U.S. military obviously respects. If they didn't respect it, the support for Ukraine would be different. So Vladimir Putin isn't coming to this with no cards either. The Russian military, while it's not quite able to project force like the Americans, is very good at its own border. And that's where they are. So I think that's the rock and the hard place. It's tough to say which way to go on this.
Do you think that it's been bad? That the scenes we saw in the White House between President Trump and President Zelensky were unedifying, that the US mineral deal that's been requested is simply just going to take resource out of Ukraine rather than give them the ability to rebuild? Or is it actually a stroke of genius? Is it smart to have US workers on the ground? Because ultimately that buys US into Ukraine to try and prevent any further Russian aggression once a peace deal can be agreed.
It buys that integration, and it also, if you'll see around the world, the U.S. will embed in Kurdistan, for example, we'll embed U.S. special forces there. That way, the Turkish can't bomb the Kurdish forces that are potentially separatists there. So Americans, by putting Americans in harm's way, in a weird way, create bubbles of safety. Now, when you look at that deal, I think it's really important to understand. In any other situation, the people who are financing the deal, who are going to bring the technology and all the expertise and the money, are going to do a 90-10 split. That's how it's done across all markets where there's minerals to be had. Doing a 50-50 deal is very generous, and that's almost intended entirely to stimulate the local, or Ukrainian national economy. So I would say 50-50 is incredibly generous. It's something that's not done in the private sector, that only a state-to-state S2S relationship could emerge, as rare as that is. And I think it's a really great sign of America's furthering commitment. And keep in mind the billions and hundreds of billions we've already given from our taxpayers, and I think that this deal ties us in further, and you can win battles with ledgers and accounting rather than bullets and rockets, I think.
Well, going on to another story, Errol, if you don't mind. President Trump has now delayed what it was going to be a 50% tariff on the European Union. He's extended that deadline now to the 9th of July, following a call that was instigated by the European Union President, Ms von der Leyen, who early on Sunday night said she had a good call with President Trump and that Europe is ready to advance talks swiftly and decisively to reach a good deal. We would need the time until the 9th of July. Is this just showing us the art of the deal that President Trump's always been good at? That ultimately he's put the squeeze, he's put the threat out there. Yes, it might be rough and ready politics that from a bygone age, but by jolly, does it get people to the table and minds concentrated and people quickly coming up with things they're willing to trade on and off, rather than wishy-washy memos sent between lots of civil servants that never result in any meaningful deal?
Oh, absolutely. This is the first time we have a businessman in the White House. It's only been a statesman or a war hero before. And he's got a 4-year term, nothing after that, and he's here to close deals. And I think the Europeans and other people have caught on that if you come to the table quickly, the Trump administration or the Trump negotiating team might not even be ready for that. You might have a better deal coming quickly than sitting back and allowing them to think about it. So I was actually very encouraged to see the Europeans reach out and want to have that deal. And they didn't ask for very much of a delay, really. It was very reasonable. And Trump's obviously happy to give it. I think he's more focused on rebalancing that trade imbalance on the industrial goods and protecting the U.S. tech companies as well. We have a lot of money that's trapped in Ireland that ideally would be tax revenue for the U.S. tax base from American companies. And that's something that's obviously big for the Irish economy, but also a big thing that Trump's working on for the American people who sent him there to do stuff like that. So there are going to be areas where we can negotiate, and especially on tariffs with industrial products, pharmaceuticals, cars, these type of things. And I think what Trump wants more than anything is a deal, a better deal, and he wants to have a deal with everybody, even if it's a small deal. That's the kind of guy he is, and I think the Europeans are understanding it, and they realize we're their best ally. We're the guys who spend money to defend and propagate Western values, and I think they'll come along with us, and it'll be a better than the first time around where they were very anti-Trump. Now I think they're working with us. It'll be better for everybody all around.
I think it's interesting you said small deal, because I think a lot of criticism in the UK from certain political opponents of the government was that the deal with the US was small. It didn't get the UK back to the pre-tariff terms, but it was certainly improvement on what the tariffs were. And I suggest from what you're saying there that actually sometimes just getting a small deal, building some goodwill with this administration goes a long way to when you want to get a much bigger slice of the pie going forward, knowing that also that Trump does drive a hard bargain, and there's going to have to be some trade-offs, and again focus minds on what are you truly willing to dig your heels in versus what are you willing to try and find a way forward on.
Oh, I would agree completely, and you gotta pick and choose with President Trump what hill you're gonna die on, and I think it's a better choice in a lot of times to go with the perspective he has. Now that doesn't mean the Europeans shouldn't negotiate for the best deal for their people, and shouldn't maybe take that first small deal as you guys have in the UK, and then use that to your advantage going down the line. I mean, he's somebody who's willing to work with other people, and somebody who wants to unlock the resources and the actual might of all of these countries, especially in regards to the drilling in the North Sea and certain interests that he has in the UK himself. So I would agree with your analysis completely there.
And finally for me, Errol, there's been an amazing story coming out that from the State Department that officials are examining the treatment of Lucy Connolly. Lucy Connolly, who did write an awful post on social media, but deleted it 4 hours later, and a couple of days after gave a full apology and accepted that she had been swept in by malicious and untrue statements. And yet, for the crime of having a social media post and deleting it, was to receive 31 months in prison, has recently had her attempt to appeal that rejected in the UK court, and yet there are literal paedophiles walking the streets of this country who have had suspended sentences. In fact, Robert Jenrick pointed out that there was one domestic abuser with 52 prior offences who got off with just a suspended sentence, and a paedophile with 110,000 indecent images of children also let off. How interested, and JD Vance kind of has raised this before, how seriously should the UK government take the fact the US administration is very concerned about how free speech is being looked after in the UK? And quite frankly, should the UK even care what the US thinks in this regard?
Well, I think that the concern should be from the American people who have put these people in office who are showing this concern. So it's when your special relationship, when your closest allies, maybe your best ally, reaches out and says, "Hey, we think you've kind of gone off kilter. You've lost your way here." That's what a good ally should do. Now, I don't think that this would be something that we blow up any sort of alliance about, but it certainly seems to be a very large custodial sentence on something that in America you would not have even been arrested for because of our First Amendment. And it's not America's business to tell any country, as Trump has recently said, by the point of the gun, we shouldn't be spreading democracy. The same way we shouldn't be going around and telling people how to run their country. But since we have such a good relationship, since we go back so far, I think it's fair for us to reach out and say, hey, this really seems antithetical to Western values, 31 months in prison for a post. And it stands out to the American people who are voting for our politicians who are coming and saying that. So it's not just the Trump administration in America who feels that way. It's a lot of Americans who, just the same way a British person who's not paying a lot of attention might say, well, there's a lot of gun violence in America. That's kind of creepy. The same thing, Americans. Yeah, I've never really been to London, but I hear you can't make a social media post. So that's sort of where it is. And I think it's something that the British shouldn't care about on a macro scale, but on the micro sense, it could be valuable to potentially look at the Americans as a leadership role in free speech, which at least this administration has been part of, and the censorship and everything that went across the board, including in America in the last admin, and then going back, maybe take another look at that. And if you still decide that having her in prison for 31 months is the way to do it, then it's not our business. But at least it's our business to maybe reach out and question why.
Well, Erol Morkoc from Republican Overseas, thank you so much for joining us today and putting forward those perspectives. If you're interested to tell us what you thought, call 0344 499 1000. Text